Hi, welcome to the content talk on active and engaged teaching and learning behaviors in constructivist education. First, I want to acknowledge the children, the teachers, and the families that you will see in photos throughout this content talk. These photos are from different projects that occurred in classrooms across primarily Kansas City, Missouri, and the greater metropolitan surrounding area. Many of the classrooms that you will see were comprised of diverse children from different backgrounds, and many of the children were either dual language learners, maybe a Head Start classroom, or children in a Title I classroom, etc. In today's content talk, the goal is for you to understand more clearly what is constructivism and how does constructivist teaching and learning behaviors differ from traditional teaching. When I say traditional teaching, what I am referring to is the behavioral transmission model, which is a predominant way that is the teacher saying, here's what I do, now here's how you do it, now go do it. Instead, we're going to be focusing on how do children construct knowledge through these constructivist practices. And primarily, the focus is going to be on what the teacher does. First, let's look at a couple of definitions that were apparent in this week's reading. There were two readings for this week. This content talk is really going to help explain a few of the main concepts that were in the Rita DeVries paper. Her paper set out to really define constructivist education. What is constructivism? And it helped to share different research studies on different constructivist approaches. That's one thing to keep in mind is there's the constructivism ideals and principles, what theoretically constructivism is, and then we have different models of constructivism, or I should say curriculum approaches to what constructivism looks like in the classroom. First, constructivism is based on children's interests. Constructivist education understands, practices, the teachers understand that children's interest drives their approaches to learning. Children naturally are curious about the world around them. They want to explore, they want to touch and feel and investigate their world. And they do this predominantly as they begin the world through sensory motor activities. And then as the children grow and develop, they're able to and want to experiment the phenomenon of the physical world in much more increasing ways. So now let's look at the fact that constructivism boils down to how a learner learns, how a brain develops. So the basic tenet is children construct knowledge. They are actively constructing their understandings of the world, which leads to the child developing knowledge, personality, and moral development. So it's not just about cognitive development, it is also about our understanding of how to interact in the world that leads towards the development of morality. They construct knowledge and reasoning about the world. This is the kind of knowledge where we understand how things in the world work empirically and how things work in the world logically. Piaget helped us to understand this through different terms such as assimilation and accommodation, disequilibrium. When children are involved in these types of states of constructing knowledge, they encounter new knowledge that requires new schema to be developed from old schema. Children also have a natural tendency to form theories about the world that seem illogical to the adult. Yet these are examples of the child working to make meaning or making sense out of the world. As the child grows, develops, and experiences more about the real world around them, and through social interaction with peers and other adults, the child becomes increasingly capable to draw logical conclusions through the use of active, engaging processes such as experimentation, prediction, exploration, active engagement. There are goals of constructivist education. So there's those fundamental principles and tenets of believing that through interaction in the world, trying to understand objects, you're developing mental structures that help you to have the knowledge that you need for growing and learning. And you do this through an active process. There are also then goals of being a constructivist educator or a constructivist learner. The first regards academic content, because this is not about chaos. If you were to come into my classroom and all the children could be actively jumping in a bounce house, that would be a lot of fun. That's very active, but it's not necessarily the type of activity that's going to lead to children learning the academic content that they need. Excuse me. So not only is it that children learn academic content in constructive education, but they also engage in activities that increase their potential for developing self-regulation and reasoning. So it is bridging together exactly what the framework of 21st century thinking is getting at. So we've known this for hundreds of years, but now we have another trend in education, and this time it's packaged in the idea of a 21st century learner. And it is so vital and so true. So I'm not minimizing the fact that it's a trend in a package, because constructivist education has been around for so long, but it's a twofold piece. Not only is it about knowledge of academic skills, and what we need as a good mathematician and reader and writer and scientist, but it's also understanding community, creativity, collaboration. It's understanding self-regulation of thinking and self-regulation of behavior. Most of the time when teachers talk about self-regulation, we think about behavior, children's behavior, but it's both self-regulation of thinking and self-regulation of behavior. And then reasoning. It's not just about being able to answer the question, what is it, when we present something to children. It's about helping children answer the questions such as, I wonder, how did you know that? I wonder why we think that. I wonder how we could think of it differently. I wonder what else we might try. Tell me why you think that is. It's about helping children to really think deeply about their world so that they construct the knowledge that is empirical. There's a focus on children's interests, their actions, and their thinking. And then finally, as we think about this, we might want to think about when we focus on children's interests, their actions, and their thinking, we have to think about on what our behaviors are. How, as the teacher, do I set up my classroom and provocations that invite children to think? And children learn in a community that's collaborative. They're learning not only the academic content that's integrated, but they're also learning that self-regulation and morality piece that's the other side of constructivist education. So through their role in learning, how are children becoming autonomous? How are they developing to understand that we do learn from mistakes? So when we make a mistake, how do we fix that? And then morally, can I self-regulate my own behaviors within a very supportive environment rather than one where there's authoritative discipline, which does not allow a child to develop the kinds of moral developmental skills that are needed for when they really are developing older in their youth and then adulthood. Now let's take a look at the types of knowledge that are formed. One of the things that Piaget outlined for us, and then again Constance Camille, who was a student of Piaget, went further to articulate how children develop different types of knowledge. And we need to understand that this cognitive perspective in the cognitive theory was really on child development and learning, and then moves into youth and then further on in adulthood once we go through those stages. But when we think about the focus on constructing knowledge, we need to really understand that we now have evidence that you are constructing a brain. You're actually building neural networks, but neural networks need really good experiences for them to be optimized. So what's interesting is that proof of constructivism and construction of knowledge can really be linked to brain research. And you will read some of that brain research this semester, particularly in the Becoming Young Thinkers, which I often just call the Burgundy book to help you access it quickly. So let's look at these different types of knowledge. There are 3 types of knowledge. Social conventional knowledge. This must be taught. It must be told, it must be transmitted, but it will be learned more effectively and meaningfully as seen useful to the learner. So we seek to create authentic context for active learning, but again, social knowledge is just something that is going to be learned from the environment. Someone's going to tell them about it. Most of the time, it can be culturally determined. And therefore, it's arbitrary from learner to learner because each of us may have a different cultural background and a social background in our home life and then moving into the school life. So there are things such as customs, particular names, labels for things. Children do not construct this type of knowledge. It must be told or transmitted from one culture to another. This is why it's very important that when we have children with diverse backgrounds in our classrooms, and since school, the idea of school in general in the United States has been predominantly led by monolingual, so people that speak one language, monolingual, white, Protestant, middle class, female teachers. And I'm saying we because I actually reflect all of those characteristics, but that's like the national characteristic of a teacher. Then that teacher typically perpetuates the values and social nature of the larger society. So when we have children from different linguistic backgrounds, from different cultural backgrounds, we have to make sure that we use language and terms that they can understand, especially when it comes to how we're teaching routines in our classroom. A good example of this, and this is why I will tell you in this course, we are not teaching children colors. We are not teaching children shapes directly. They are going to learn that from pure interaction with you and each other in the classroom daily. We're not going to drill and skill on basic facts. And often basic facts can fit in this category, like identifying a letter of the alphabet, identifying a number, knowing the color of a counting chip, knowing not only that the color is yellow, but also that the object that you're showing the child is actually called a counting chip, if that's what you're going to use it as in your classroom. So that's an example. Physical knowledge, this knowledge is constructed. In fact, it must be constructed. It is understanding the physical world and how objects and materials behave as a result of their characteristics and attributes. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and just say that I think this physical knowledge is really what drives constructivist learning. It's the interest that's there that has to get the child involved in certain objects, but it is then working with objects to understand different characteristics. So it's not just that it's a characteristic about that object, but it's a characteristic that then can be transmitted to other things in the world. It does lay the foundation for more abstract thinking, more abstract thought, and it is empirical, which means it is. There is no shifting this type of knowledge. So knowing that the color and the weight of a counting chip, so for example, if we had a counting chip and we could identify what its color was and we could identify that it had weight, we would understand there are natural, inherent, physical, visible, and invisible characteristics, right? So the visible characteristic of the counting chip is that it has a color, and the invisible characteristic of the counting chip is that there's some sort of weight to it, okay? Then there's logical or logico. In some writings, you will see it L-O-G-I-C-O, mathematical knowledge. Any reading by Constance Camille that you do, remember Constance Camille is a direct descendant of Piaget. She was one of his students. I've actually seen her present several times. She's very old right now, elderly, and often I worry about many of our second line generation constructivists who are passing away. She contributed such knowledge to this idea of types of knowledge, and she writes extensively about mathematics. And mathematics itself falls under here, but not necessarily the mathematics that we may encounter on worksheets and workbooks that we see. It involves really construction of knowledge about mental relationships, and the ultimate source of these relationships is the individual's mind. So what's interesting, for example, like with addition, children will, if they are able to manipulate and construct and act on and experience different objects, they will learn the addition property through constructing it. Now, in this graph, it says it cannot be told. Well, we can tell kids how to add, but they won't truly understand it and do it independently as well as they can if they don't construct this knowledge. That's why when some sorts of mathematical concepts are tried to be directly taught to younger children too early, not too early because of their learning capabilities, but too early because they haven't had the opportunities to construct it in the way they need to. So for example, when a child is coordinating relationships of objects, so maybe the relationship of same or different, they can create that relationship between two objects. You know, they might see a red counting chip and a yellow counting chip, and they might say, ooh, these two things are the same because they're both a counting chip, but they're different because they're different colors. So this is where we see sorting. This is one of the reasons why sorting and classifying objects is such a predominant activity and skill that we look for in preschool children and in kindergartners. We want to give them maximum opportunities. And what we see is that children will then begin to reason, and they will make further sets and further subsets. They will apply this understanding of classification to other things in the world, such as animals. They will realize, oh, there are other animals than dogs in the world. And those animals are characterized by physical attributes, etc. So these are three important things to keep in mind that may come up in other readings. But my guess is you may have only scratched the surface of knowing about these things in previous courses or educational experiences. But they are very central to understanding how we construct knowledge. All right, so now let's get right down to what's a constructivist classroom feel like, and what does it not, and what isn't it? So in constructivist classrooms, learning is often real. It's authentic. So if children might be learning in a shoe project, for example, let's say that they are experimenting with their own shoes. You're introducing this topic and wondering if it's something that children might be interested in. Instead of giving them a printout and cut activity that you pulled from Pinterest. Now, I know you all don't get to see me as I'm saying this, and we have not developed a relationship yet, but you can tell what type of message I'm giving you about the activity on the right. Even though we see this predominantly in preschools, it is not authentic and real. It's something that we call contrived. We are trying to simulate and look at what the topic is, right? On the right, it's about colors. We're going to match colors. Oh, and teachers are going to say, it's a fine motor skill. Children are going to have to cut out with scissors, and then they're going to manipulate, and they're going to move these little pieces around. We can do better. And I want you to know, anything that I say in any of our slides, I probably have done as a teacher myself in my early years of teaching before I really understood constructivism well and deeply and had experienced myself the difference between doing a worksheet activity that may be contrived versus one that's real. So everybody's wearing shoes in the classroom, and even when I taught in a school setting where some of my children actually didn't really have any shoes, and we would find ways to provide them for them, we were still able to use the real objects. And anytime we can use the real objects. So think about a shoe for a minute. What type of information is academic content that can be integrated in an authentic experience? What is there? Well, we have words on shoes, we have symbols on shoes. Some of the symbols are numeracy, some of the symbols are letters, some of the symbols are actual signs and logos. There's different parts of a shoe, there's different sizes of shoes, there are different kinds of shoes for different purposes. So it makes the thinking much, much more divergent and much more open to what children already know, and it means it's open-ended versus on the right-hand side it's contrived. There's one right way to match these shoes versus all of the different colors and the different attributes that can be discussed on the left-hand side. So we could actually do probably 20 activities thinking from the approach of what's happening on the left-hand side of the screen. So Constructivist education focuses on authentic and real objects that are directly connected to our cultural setting versus contrived activities that are just single selected activities by teachers. Constructivist education is open-ended. There's not one right way to always complete a task. Certainly we are going to help children with social conventional knowledge. We're going to tell them, oh, this is a green truck. If we're matching to the green truck, we need to find a green wheel. If we're representing it as it is, that's an example of social constructivist knowledge and how we would just talk about that. But in terms of being able to find an entry point into an activity, we keep activities open-ended versus closed-ended. So this is another way that we can see in the left-hand side, children in a garbage and recycling truck project, they'd been observing the garbage truck and the recycling truck that came to their playground every day, actually about the same time that they were always out on the playground. So this is what became the impetus for starting this project. Now, in the project approach, you're going to learn that there's 3 different phases, and that's because for this constructivist approach, there's a structure so that teachers know how to focus children on things that are meaningful and that it stays intentional, because sometimes that's the criticism that we have of constructivism is, oh, everybody's just choosing their own thing to do. Well, no, even though it's open-ended, we have very intentional goals that we're directing children to. So in this exercise, children could represent what they were learning any way that they want to. Many children were choosing to represent either the garbage truck or the recycling truck, and so they were using different recyclable materials, bringing in that idea of recycling. They were using recyclable materials to construct their models, their representations of the other 2 trucks. This is a very common type of construction You could call it an art activity, but if we call it an art activity, it may lose its open-endedness, because think about it, guys, right? When we think about art activity, usually we've experienced a teacher showing a little picture, maybe of a tree and how you're going to paint the leaves of fall, or maybe you show a little rabbit and where everybody's going to put the ears and the nose and the eyes. Which we all know that's called a craft, right? So I hesitate to call it an art activity. Rather, it's about representation, and we'll talk more about that this semester. Closed-ended is where there's only one answer. So it's either paper, it's either plastic, or it's aluminum. So even though there's three choices there, you're just matching, right? You're just matching. That's not much critical thinking going on with matching. Whereas with open-ended, you have divergent thinking going on. Many aspects of planning how you're going to do something, brainstorming what you're going to need, planning further to get your materials together, and then testing out the plan you've made. In constructivist classrooms, inquiry-based learning is the predominant mode of how children learn. The academic content is organized around a topic of interest, whether it's teacher-directed inquiry where the teacher selects and brings in the questions for children to investigate, or if you take a little step further where children are asking questions about a topic and doing inquiry-based activities such as surveying, interviewing experts, visiting a field site where they can actively research and investigate what's happening. This is versus rote activities. In rote activities, sorry, the slide went forward before I could pull up the other picture. Rote activities is where there's just one way to do something and where teachers are doing a lot of the telling instead of children actively investigating. Connected learning means that you are intentionally connecting developmental learning domains and grade level standards to the content and the concepts that are inherent to the topic. So every kind of topic, this is an example, dogs. And then dogs has different inherent topics. Well, dogs have needs, there's different types of dogs have characteristics, there may be community dogs that help others in a different way. And so these are concepts inherent to the topic of dogs. And then we map out the types of learning that will happen, whether it's mathematical knowledge, whether it's scientific, whether it's inquiry, whether it's language. We are intentionally connecting versus arbitrary. Now this is a picture of the creative curriculum, which is a wonderful curriculum tool. It's not to represent creative curriculum, because I think creative curriculum is a wonderful curriculum tool. It is just to represent that sometimes when we do packaged curriculum that is already built without the children, it may not be connected to their background knowledge. It may not be connected to the interests that they have. It may not be connected to their culture. And it certainly may not be connected to what that group of children, are ready to learn in terms of development and learning standards. So the thing to think about is think about a substitute teacher. A substitute can come in and teach from that learning manual. But in a constructivist classroom, teachers are understanding deeply how concepts and standards connect not only to one another, but to how the children in their classroom, that particular time frame, are learning and connected to the children's cultural, linguistic backgrounds. In constructivist education, our teaching behaviors are focused on helping children construct knowledge versus instructing the children. This was a community community garden that was outside of a early childhood center. And the children were very interested in this garden. Community volunteers were coming to help with the garden. And once the children started really looking at a lot of the books in the classroom about gardens and asking more questions, that's when the teacher realized, I need to think about ways to help the children construct real knowledge about gardens. And that's when the children interviewed an expert that came from the Community Garden Initiative that was in that area. The children actually helped to harvest some of the vegetables that were growing there. They were able to taste some of the vegetables that they harvested. They used them in other ingredients, and so they really experienced and constructed knowledge. Versus a teacher could have instructed on those things, a teacher could have told them the answers, a teacher could have used traditional teaching methods. But the difference is enabling the children to actively investigate their own questions, meet with the real people, and experience it with firsthand knowledge. We are facilitators, again, rather than instructor. So when we are thinking about a constructivist educator, it is someone who is understanding how they set the environment up, how they arrange their classroom, how they put themselves in a learning experience as a co-player with a child, rather than the one who has all the answers, who's going to tell children what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. We're facilitating their moral development, their social development, and their academic and cognitive development through our questions, through how we intentionally organize the environment, and how we support all learners. We are an investigator, and we focus on getting children to investigate rather than imitate. So we want to provide materials and resources. We want to support children's questions. We help them to come up with a plan for how they might investigate things, and then we provide support to facilitate deeper investigation. When we do this, children are not just imitating a model that we provide for them. They're not just imitating our actions. They're actually constructing their own individual meaning of the world and making that meaning connect to others in their classroom, and particularly in project work, maybe even outside of their classroom. We are fostering autonomy. Autonomy is that children have free, self-determined self-direction. They understand choices, and they know how to develop and learn to make the right choice as far as their learning goes, as far as their behavior goes. But when we offer choices in classrooms like setting up center time, many of you probably have had experiences having centers in your classroom. That's one way that you supported children to be autonomous learners. This is versus constrained, dependent activities. When we constrain children, then we don't allow them to be independent. Rather, they're dependent on us to tell them how to do everything. They're dependent on others to keep them in line, for example. And usually it could be by methods such as coercion, or there's an over-reliance. Then we have children who maybe really need to learn that autonomous component and develop that, that self-confidence and self-esteem, but because we're constraining them in our environment, they become less self-reliant and they become overly dependent on others. The constructivist teacher is a mentor who takes a cooperative attitude in relation to the children and uses natural and logical consequences as alternatives to authoritarian discipline. So when you see the teacher, telling the children, no, don't do that, no, don't, no, 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 instead of helping them develop to make those choices, then we see that moral development is being compromised. Shared interactions versus forced or controlled interactions. Sometimes in a contrived environment, meaning that it's so teacher-directed, the teacher's creating everything and all the experiences. Children might be compliant, because they know what happens when they're not, but it's not a very authentic or fun, right? A lot of you have experience knowing that fun and learning is important. And sometimes when we have to force children, it may not necessarily pique their interest. It hasn't hooked them in a way. And so we really want to, rather than create those constrained interactions, we want to focus on shared interactions, shared activities where children are learning right alongside their children, where teachers are participating as a participant and an investigator. Even if you know everything there is to know about spiders, or in this picture, we might know more about baking than children, but instead we are learning right along with them as a shared interaction, and we're giving children autonomy. This word wall, for example, was created by children in an inclusive preschool setting. So many of the children actually in that particular classroom had medically fragile needs, or they had diagnosed disabilities. And this was a word wall that was created throughout a long-term project, and children were able to manipulate different materials and find new words to add to the wall, and they used them in a variety of ways. It is definitely about thinking. In a constructivist classroom, we're focused on getting children to think. This is from several different projects, one of them being the Doctor Project, which happened at Ability KC in Kansas City, which is an inclusive special education center for children with special needs. And the teacher actually said about this project, she was amazed at how the children absorbed many specific vocabulary words related to the Doctor Project. She heard the children use the names of tools while role-playing. I would identify pictures or ask questions about ambulances, x-rays, the types of doctors that they had interacted with that she had not even heard before. The children themselves were used to visiting many doctors because of some of their experiences, and so it was creating hands-on experiences such as the role-playing or making model bones from clay or creating paper mache casts that you can see there on the left to simulate, casts for broken bones, that the children were so connected, and the deep thinking that happened from the classroom was phenomenal.